The World Leaders Index has some of the most powerful stratagems in all of Warhammer 40,000. But how do you maximize these potent abilities and balance your CP economy to get the most out of this rule set? Let's dive into this episode of Competitive Insights and find out. Hello everyone and welcome back to the Red Path. My name is Dara and today's video is going to be a competitive deep dive into the stratagem selection available to the World Leaders Index in 10th edition. These are probably one of the strongest sets of stratagems across all the indexes in the game, but managing their usage and understanding when to apply each one is complex. If you're looking for an in-depth analysis of these abilities, then this is the video for you. We're going to firstly discuss command point economy and management, since this is one of the most vital skills to learn in order to leverage the abilities available, and probably one of the aspects that people struggle with initially. Then we'll touch on which of the generic strats are actually worth looking at before diving into our index stratagems and examining them in great detail. Finally, I'll be answering some Patreon questions relating to this video, which will provide some interesting context to the overall discussion. As a note, this video is for higher levels of competitive play, so there will be some assumptions made on certain abbreviations, abilities, and rules, but that's not to say a more casual player won't get anything out of it either. There's a lot to dive into here today, so let's not waste any time. Grab yourselves a brew, and let's kick things off with managing your CP economy. One of the big learning curves of 10th edition was transitioning to a new command point economy system, whereby you generate command points at the beginning of each player turn rather than having a fixed amount from the start of the game. With fewer command points at your disposal overall, you have to be very careful with their usage, especially since world leaders don't have any easy ways to regenerate CP or free use abilities. An overeager general who spends their precious CP on rerolls, for example, will find themselves sometimes lacking the punch they need on their go turns. It's also very easy to use your CP incorrectly, activating stratagems which functionally aren't really necessary to achieve your goals. So how do we manage our command points during the game to avoid these mistakes? Well, let's start off by discussing secondary missions. World Leaders are a very dynamic army with enough speed and punch to play tactical secondaries exceptionally well. It's extremely rare that I would ever consider using fixed secondaries, partly for the ease with which I can score most of the tactical cards, but also for the chance to gain extra command points by discarding a card at the end of my turn. The capacity to generate an extra CP using this method is very strong for setting up defensively at the end of a punch turn when you are worried about the hitback. Functionally, it means that you will be going into your opponent's turn with 2 CP since you gen 1 at the top of their round as well. This offers you a wealth of interesting choices, from activating -1 damage in combat to heroic interventions and combat interrupts, allowing you to regain agency during your opponent's turn. Or you could wait and keep those CP for your own turn, where you will have an awful lot to work with. Sometimes I'll be in situations where I deliberately don't score a low victory point secondary, like Investigate Signals, just so I can generate an extra CP and posture. It's a lot more common for this to occur in the first couple of turns, particularly the first battle round, where a bad card draw can pull some unachievable cards. I call this a bad draw, but it's not really. Generally, you'll have one card that you can always score and one which you can't, which is actually the ideal setup for a World Leaders player, since accruing CP in the early game is very important to ensuring that you can deliver hard punches in the mid. One common mistake I see people making during this stage is that they will spend a CP when they draw a bad card to discard it immediately in battle round 1 or 2, so they can draw another one. I think this is a bad play for a few reasons. Firstly, you're spending a very important CP immediately, meaning you can't use any strats during your active turn in the first battle round, something which you will often want to do. Secondly, the chances are high that you will simply draw another unscorable card, meaning you've also wasted that CP. Thirdly, it's very possible to max out your secondary score even if you don't score perfectly in the first couple of turns. So if I get a dread card in turn 1, I often see this as a positive thing. Personally, I tend to play a slower paced game of 40k than most World Leader players, meaning I will spend the first turn or two banking as much CP as possible, so that when I move into my more active turns, I have a wealth of options to hand that I can activate. If you prefer a faster paced rush style of world eaters, you actually have to be more careful with your stratagem usage, but broadly speaking, the same theory will apply to both styles when it comes to actually deploying your stratagems. I tend to divide this into 4 categories of usage, depending on the specific situation that I am applying a stratagem. I term these as absolutely necessary, safety net, overcompensating, and desperation play. Absolutely necessary stratagems are ones which, if I do not use, are likely to result in a very bad board state, potentially losing me key units, lots of victory points, or failing to get crucial kills. Safety net stratagems are ones which I am slightly uncomfortable with a certain situation and would like a cushion of surety to ensure that the play I'm making doesn't fail. Overcompensating plays involve using a stratagem in a situation which doesn't actually require it. This typically would involve using something like our +1 to wound stratagem on a target which is almost guaranteed to be dead even without its use, or auto-advancing a unit 6 inches when even a low roll on the advance would see them in a favourable position. Desperation plays, in the last hand, are using a stratagem which is unlikely to actually result in success, but a necessary risk to avoid a really terrible situation. Typically, that's where the command point reroll would fall for me, and I absolutely hate using rerolls. This type of stratagem categorization can help you evaluate a board state and balance your CP economy. What I mean by this is understanding how best to apply the CP in your pool based on how you would categorize the usage of your stratagems. For example, a desperation play stratagem is somewhat fine to do if you have 3 or 4 CP in the bank, but if you're using your only CP on such a situation, you're taking a huge risk which likely isn't worth it. Weighing up the necessity of a stratagem, its outcomes and benefits versus your current CP pool is an absolutely crucial skill to learn. Generally speaking, at the top of each player turn and battle round, I will try to predict the play pattern of the turn. This is easier to do during my own turn since I know roughly what my plans will be, but also anticipating how my opponent responds to these plays is an important factor too. Then, examining my command point pool, I will walk through which stratagems I intend to activate during my turn, what categories of usage they fall into, and then making a decision on which ones I will actually use based on that categorization. Of course, I always try to predict my opponent's response, as this is a vital part of balancing my CP usage in my turn, since I may need to save 2 or 3 CP for their turn for combat interrupts, heroic interventions, or -1 damage. To give a loose example of this, say I'm starting battle round 3 and about to move into my go turn. After rolling my blessings and picking my tactical cards, I'm going to take a few minutes to plan out my turn. This will typically involve deciding which units are going to push where, what sort of charge rolls I will need to make, and how likely they are to kill their targets. Once I've decided on this, I'll then work out which categories my stratagems fall into. For example, does a berserker unit need some help overcoming a tough vehicle? Are my 8-bound making a long push which might require an auto 6 on the advance roll? Do I need to throw up an extra blessing in the fight phase to push my damage ceiling higher? Depending on how much CP I have and how I categorize those stratagems, I will then make my final decision and launch into my turn. This allows me to play fast during my actual phases since I've already made the key decisions at the top of the round. To summarize, managing CP economy, I really think the key aspect is understanding how valuable each strat is at a given time, if it's necessary to use it, and if you're making a meaningless play or silly risk which could be better spent elsewhere. Using tactical cards to gain CP rather than lose them is absolutely vital to ensure our army can function to the best of its ability, and planning out a turn or battle round will really help your own ability to balance your remaining CP with the things you need to do. Use your CP efficiently to gain powerful board states and victory points, rather than squandering them on CP rerolls or overkilling units. Before we deep dive next into our own index stratagems, let's touch on which of the core stratagems are actually useful for our army and worth considering when planning out those turns. There are quite a few core stratagems available to all armies in 10th edition, and the value proposition of these varies a lot across different armies and even different lists within the same army. For world eaters, there are a couple of staples, and a few which see fringe play depending on specific list archetypes. Sometimes these strats will contest with the index stratagems on specific turns when certain situations arise that demand their use. Knowing when to deploy these core strats is important, and they are often overlooked in favour of our unique stratagems. However, as I've gotten better at 10th edition, I've found myself going back to the core strats more and more, but they can be specific to some list archetypes. Let's look at the ones first which are useful to all World Leader armies. We'll open it up by talking about two of the combat-orientated core stratagems, Combat Interrupt and Heroic Intervention. Both of these stratagems are incredibly powerful tools for World Leaders to capitalize on if they're facing another combat-heavy army. However, at 2 CP each, they also come at a premium price. 2 CP strats require a lot of thought before using, so you really have to be sure that you're going to get value out of them if you decide to make the play. The most obvious one that will gain a significant benefit is Combat Interrupt, incredibly useful when opponents multi-charge several units in a single turn. Naturally, most of our units are exceptional in close combat, so one of them interrupting the flow of combat can be devastating for an opponent. It can force very difficult decisions for them when they know you have 2 CP in the bank. And it's always good to be upfront about having this resource, since it can be easy for your opponent to lose track of your CP, and you don't want to gotcha them if they choose a less important combat to fight in first. Generally speaking, I consider Combat Interrupt a worthwhile stratagem to use if it fulfills some of the following conditions. My unit can comfortably kill the enemy unit they are interrupting into. My unit will be able to considerably reduce the model count of an enemy unit that poses a large problem for my game plan. My unit will be able to fulfill an important role in the following turn, such as securing a board area or taking out another key enemy unit. Or my unit is on an objective, and interrupting will ensure that they maintain control of that objective, thus scoring me primary points in the following turn. Naturally, depending on how many of these boxes get ticked, the value of the combat interrupt will increase or decrease, but generally speaking, regardless of the situation, it is a powerful tool to have available. However, I always consider that, should I use Combat Interrupt, I will be unable to use something like the -1 damage stratagem, which is another powerhouse ability. Sometimes there are situations where a Combat Interrupt could whiff, if the unit is interrupting into a particularly tough enemy, and then they end up getting killed, and you've spent 2 CP for nothing. If I'm worried about such a situation, I'll generally favour -1 damage, since it is more of a guaranteed effect and usually pays off. Again, when it comes to making that choice, you logically weigh up which of the two stratagems is more impactful, since you will almost never be in a situation where you can use both of them. Heroic Interventions, on the other hand, are much more situational, but can be extremely devastating. As another 2 CP core strat, the price is high, but you have to be very sure that the Heroic Intervention move is number 1, not likely to fail, and number 2, going to make enough of a difference that it is worthwhile for the 2 CP cost. Heroic Interventions are particularly powerful for our army because we have access to the Master of Executions, who gives his unit fight first. This means that by intervening into a combat, you can rescue a threatened unit, since Mo will get to swing even before the unit that has charged. Honestly, I would rarely consider using Heroic Intervention on a unit that doesn't have Mo, since your opponent will be able to strike first, and if they're using a particularly devastating unit, may end up decimating the 2 of your units at your own expense. However, Mo heroics can very much swing a board state if they are lined up correctly. You can also use the threat of that Heroic Intervention to force your opponent to position suboptimally if they know you have the 2 CP in the bank to do the move. And though it's not quite yet gained popular traction, one tech piece that I've been using a lot recently to great success in my 30 Berserker list is a second Master of Executions with Battle Lust, which allows him to use that Heroic Intervention move for free. This has come in very clutch in some of my practice games, and if you're messing around with unconventional lists, I recommend you take a look at that enhancement. And keeping in theme with those unconventional choices, some of the other core stratagems tend to lean into those unusual list archetypes. For example, Tank Shock is fantastic on lists which use Mauler Fiends. Go to Ground is exceptional on a 20-man Jackal squad next to a Demon Prince, while Grenades can always be worth considering if you're running into something like a Catan Shard. While I don't often use these stratagems myself in my current archetypes, it is important to consider them if you're building a list that can utilize them. Just remember that something like tank shocking maulers is fantastic until you can't use your +1 to wound stratagem and end up fluffing combat. Again, evaluating that reward and balancing it against other things you want to be doing in a turn is key to making a decision on if a stratagem is worth playing. But let's turn our attention now to the index stratagems and dive into these amazing abilities. First on the list is Gory Massacre. You should never use this stratagem. If you use this stratagem, I don't know what to say to you. Seek help. Let's move on. For a good stratagem, Fur the Skull Throne. I think this is probably one of my most used strats in 10th edition. Functionally, it gives a unit +1 to wound in combat when they're fighting a character, vehicle or monster for 1 CP. With so many attached character units in the game and a plethora of big targets, this stratagem can be used across a wide variety of enemy units. +1 to wound abilities are one of the strongest offensive buffs available in the game right now, essentially increasing your overall wound roll efficiency by about 16%. This will push a variety of our units into punch up damage territories where they can uptrade into high value enemy units. For the likes of Exalted 8-Bound, it means they can wound anything in the game on 2s, for example. It can really help Berserkers get over the line into tougher targets, since they will wound anything between T7 and 11 on 4s. And in a Khorne led squad, that means they can absolutely mince significant targets. It's also a great way of countering any abilities which cause -1 to wound, something which is becoming more common as the codexes get released. The risk with this stratagem is using it to overkill a unit that you're already very likely to kill anyway, thus essentially being a waste of CP. For players with fewer reps with the army, it can be difficult to work out specific kill thresholds for our main units, and this does come with time, though you can use apps like Unit Crunch to quickly work out average thresholds for specific units. Generally speaking, I use this stratagem on targets which I define as absolute must kills, ones which pose significant threats, are denying me primary and secondary points, or will not be destroyed if I don't use the stratagem. It's sort of a waste if you use it to clean up more meaningless combats, ones which aren't really getting you any points or denying your opponent any, or eliminating a significant target. It's definitely one of the easier strats to utilize correctly, just make sure you aren't overkilling and getting good value out of the final result. Overall, I actually think this is probably one of the strongest stratagems we have in our index. Hot on the heels of that and vying for second place is the next stratagem, for the Blood God. Arguably much more complicated to implement correctly, this stratagem is spent after you kill an enemy unit and allows you to roll for an extra blessing of Khorne. For 1 CP, this is really powerful for a whole variety of different reasons and is applicable to a host of interesting situations. Probably the most obvious one here is using it to farm for rerolls to resurrect Angron. However, I recommend not doing this if the only benefit you foresee is getting the Primarch back. It should be used in conjunction with also getting a buff activated that you think will be useful. If you're going first, this stratagem is at its most powerful. Sometimes a good opening means you want to push for a potent alpha strike and get both speed buffs up immediately, advancing and charging across the board and rushing an opponent's lines. However, if you show some restraint here and don't use the auto 6 advanced stratagem, you'll be in a position where you can use your 1 CP, following that alpha punch, you can posture with using for the Blood God. Here, you can throw up one of 2 buffs to help receive the counter punch, either Feel No Pain or Fight on Death. Generally, Feel No Pain is the correct choice here, but if you're playing into a combat heavy army which is light on shooting, Fight on Death can be better. Regardless, it allows you to carry out your alpha strike at maximum speed, but then set up defensively to maximize the assets you've pushed forward. This logic holds up through the following turns, and you can utilize for the Blood God to throw up defensive buffs and receive the counterpunch, while having offensive buffs active in your turn. It gives the World Leader player a lot of flexibility and is a really powerful tool to have at your disposal, though it requires restraint, ensuring that you have the CP at the end of the turn for its activation. This stratagem tends to be a little bit less useful if you go second, as, generally speaking, you will only get to use the extra blessing ability for a short period of time before it resets at the top of the next round. However, you can still put it to good use. Sometimes you'll be in situations where you multi-charge quite a lot of combats, and some of these will be more difficult than others. In these cases, I like to start with an easy combat, which is likely to succeed. provided the opponent doesn't have the CP to interrupt. Once that's successful, I'll use for the Blood God to activate an offensive blessing such as sustained or lethal hits to help ensure that the following combats gain a significant advantage and are more likely to swing my way. While this strategy is somewhat agnostic to going first or second, it is more applicable when you are going second, since you'll want one of your initial blessings to likely be a defensive buff to weather the initial opponent's offense. The power behind For the Blood God is the flexibility it provides, allowing to shift your army into a stance which is most suited to its current challenges. A canny World Eaters player will make great use of this stratagem, alternating between offensive and defensive buffs as needed, and it's a strat which I use all the time to great effect. Next up we have Khorne Cares Not, a 2 CP stratagem which reduces damage in melee by 1, providing an interesting defensive mechanism which pairs very well with the Feel No Pain blessing. However, at a steep cost of 2 CP you have to be very careful about when you decide to use this. Naturally, it's much more useful when playing into combat heavy armies, since it can totally take the punch out of an important combat, allowing a big Berserker unit, Angron or Exalted 8-bound to make it through a fight they would have otherwise died in. It comes into its own when used against 2 damage attacks, effectively reducing their damage by 50% and massively altering the odds in your favour. Given the prevalence of these 2 damage weapons in the game, I often find myself using this stratagem following my go turn, where if a key unit manages to make it through, I can close out the game. You need to be really careful with using this, however. Assess the combat before making the play. Is your unit likely to survive without the buff? If you do use it, what are the chances that they die anyway? For example, a 6-man Exalted 8-bound brick loves this stratagem, since with layered Feel No Pain, higher toughness and 3 wounds each, damage reduction is the icing on the cake. But 10 Berserkers may not get the full power out of the strat if assaulted by a particularly vicious foe. Combat armies like Custodes, Blood Angels, Black Templars, and even other World Eaters spam those damage 2 attacks, so it's incredibly powerful in these matchups. But against the likes of Orcs, who love damage 1, it is effectively useless. As I say, it's best when you layer it with the Feel No Pain boost, since you're maximizing the likelihood of pulling through a given combat, and I would be reluctant to use this stratagem if I didn't have that blessing in play. Furthermore, it contends with other 2 CP strats like the Combat Interrupt, which are also options in the opponent's combat phase and can sometimes be more effective, as we discussed earlier. So before making the commitment to playing this stratagem, consider the possibilities and options. That said, it is very powerful, and I've used it on many an occasion to thwart an opponent and push through their ranks. Remember, our raw killing power is so high that, should you play this on a unit and it survives, it's very likely to murder the attacking unit and then be active again in your next turn, causing a massive swing when your opponent will struggle to recover from. Next up we have Blood Offering, a 1 CP stratagem which allows you to sticky an objective that a friendly unit just died on. This one is a bit more niche, but it can be really clutch in specific situations. I find myself mostly using this in the opening turns against ranged armies, placing a unit like Jackals or Spawn on a central point and allowing them to be shot off, and then sticking the objective. This forces a situation where the opponent has to then commit a resource to the center, which can be countered by lurking nearby units. It's a good way of baiting in the opposition, forcing them out of position unless they want to give you primary for free, and starting that trade game. It can also be useful in later turns of the game, if there's a far-flung objective where you have very little resources dedicated to, and the ones that you have there do get shot off, a quick 1 CP can net an extra round of primary points and force the opponent to relocate assets away from the main fight so they retake the objective. Overall, it functions best when you're playing against a gun-heavy army which doesn't want to push too aggressively, since it forces them out of position and into uncomfortable territory. However, against combat-heavy armies, it's basically useless, since you're likely to be playing a game of objective flipping throughout the turns. Since it contends with such a strong suite of stratagems, it doesn't always see play, and is often forgotten about, but don't underestimate its usefulness and the ability to break up the opponent's stronghold and pull them out of position. It can help set up the initial pace of the game moving things along in a way you dictate and allowing you to create board states that you can respond to and control. Finally, we have Apoplectic Frenzy, a 1 CP stratagem to auto 6 and advance roll. Everyone knows this combos beautifully with our advance and charge blessing, allowing units to catapult across the board at breakneck speeds. However, despite its obvious power, I find myself using this stratagem less and less as the edition goes on. Because world leaders are already incredibly fast, often this falls into the overcommitting category of stratagems, where you don't actually need it to achieve your goals. Before deciding if I use Apoplectic Frenzy, I will measure out the full distance my unit can move, adding an assumed 3 inches to the advance roll. If the charge distance following this is greater than a 6-inch charge, I'll definitely consider using the strat, but I'll also weigh up the other things which will happen if I spend the CP. For example, if this is turn 1, it means I won't be able to gain a defensive blessing using For the Blood God. If it's a big go turn, I may not have the CP to get that +1 to wound. Maybe I need 2 CP to ensure that a combat interrupt from my opponent can be reduced by playing Khorne Cares Not. There's always a lot to weigh up before making that play, and more often than not, I find myself not using Frenzy, since I'm more comfortable taking the risk on a longer charge than going without defensive or offensive boosts later on. Of course, there's a lot of situations where a long catapult move to hit a far-flung combat are absolutely necessary and will secure a lot of victory points, and in those cases, I'll almost always use the stratagem. But I want to point out that it isn't quite the auto-use strat that many people regard it as. There's a lot of tools in the World Leader stratagem box, and foregoing some of these for massive movement can be a mistake. After all, it's not much good getting to the opponent with ease if you fall flat in the combat phase. Now, there's definitely some bias here, since I tend to play a slower, more staged game of 40k, which means my go turn usually has quite short distances to cross to get to the enemy. Other players which prefer powerful alpha strike builds will require this stratagem a lot more, but I'd encourage everyone to rethink its use. Do your measurements and work out the full value of the stratagem versus your other options. Before moving on to the Patreon questions, let's take a moment to reflect. I hope I've imparted the importance of timing and sequencing your stratagems here, and how to assess a battlefield state and ensure you're applying the right strat for the right problem. To give a full list of every situation for every strat will be impossible, since there's so many interesting niche cases which regularly occur, but I think the general overview here should help. Some of our strats like the +1 to wound and For the Blood God are going to be used in almost every single turn, while -2 damage and sticking objectives are fringe cases which, while more specific, should not be discounted. And we don't talk about gory dismemberment, ever. But let's move on to Patreon questions and solve the riddles they vex me with. If you don't already know, we do have a Patreon page which you can join to support the Red Path and help fund our tournament adventures. This brings more competitive content to the channel and also gives you access to either a hobby or competitive focused channel within the Discord, where we go deep into specific topics and you can pick our brains on problems you've encountered. Any support is greatly appreciated and helps us keep doing what we're doing. And you get a chance to contribute to videos like this too. So enough plugging, let's get to those questions. First up, we have a question from Krieg regarding the timing, synchronizing, and order of usage of stratagems. I think I've touched on some of this in the video, but an interesting part here is how some of the strats can actually sync up with each other. I've had situations where going second I've used -1 damage on a unit and had it live, only to murder the opposition in response. With a spare CP in the bank, using For the Blood God here can be incredibly powerful to suddenly throw up a speed or offensive buff on my side, making my player turn much more powerful. Other combos include using +1 to wound to make sure a combat goes your way, only to then use For the Blood God to throw up sustained and lethal, causing a cascade effect for all your other combats, which may be challenging. Generally speaking, most of the strats involve syncing up some strat with For the Blood God, as it allows a big change of the game's pace, but can require a hefty investment of command points, so make sure you're budgeting correctly and allow for these dramatic swings. C. Baker M wants to know the best ways to get mileage out of For the Blood God and CP economy. I think I've answered both of these questions already, but regarding For the Blood God, the extra buffs I find myself using most are either the Feel No Pain blessing or sustained hits. These tend to be the best catch-all blessings, but it is important to remember that you can actually have situations where For the Blood God gets activated twice in a given battle round, and you can end up with 4 blessings. I've had this occur when I've activated, say, Fight on Death into a combat army, and then following me killing an enemy unit in my opponent's turn, say with a Fight First Mo, throw up Feel No Pain too. This is pretty rare to happen, but I definitely think it's the best way to maximize for the Blood God. Of course, if you're fishing for Angron rerolls, it's a good way of maximizing the amount of rerolls you get for this too. Scott Gron wants to know which secondaries are best cast into the fire to accumulate command points in the early game, and this is a good one, and I touched on sometimes not deliberately scoring cards to gain CP. I think it works best if the card is obviously unachievable, but cards which, should I achieve, will only score me 2 or 3 VPs are generally the ones that I'll choose to toss instead of scoring. I'll rarely forego scoring on a 5 VP card, but something like Investigate Signals or midboard deploy teleport homers are often considerations for the fire pit. It depends on how badly I'll need to accumulate those CP in the immediate turns after, but my general rule of thumb is to consider how much VP would be lost and weigh up the benefits of gaining CP for that. Subordinate 666 wants to know which battle tactic do I dread the most if my opponent uses a Vect-like ability to increase its cost. This one has gotta be either for the Skull Throne or for the Blood God. I really value having 3 blessings up as much as possible, or increasing the likelihood of killing tough enemy units. If I had to choose between either though, I think for the Blood God takes it. I just love that stratagem so much, and increasing it to 2 CP massively changes my ability to posture defensively, and removes a lot of the control I have during my opponent's turn. TMNT for Life wants to know how going first or second affects my stratagem usage, specifically relating to For the Blood God. I tried to work this into the analysis of that stratagem, highlighting how, if you go first, it is much more powerful. That said, there is still a lot of play to the strat if you end up going second, but it does remove some of the cool tricks you can do with it. Otherwise, I find that going first sometimes makes the sticky objective stratagem more useful in the end of the 4th battle round, since getting a unit gunned off an objective here only to sticky it can add some vital primary points in my closing turn when I'm generally running out of resource. It doesn't alter very much how I use the other stratagems, though it makes Khorne's Cares Not harder to use, since I don't have the ability to discard a tactical card and gain 2 CP back to back if I'm going first, sometimes reducing my defensive options. Rin also wants to know why For the Blood God is the best stratagem ever, but I think I've made a pretty convincing case for that already. And that about closes out our Patreon questions and this video. I do hope you found it useful and you can take some tips here to take to the table and improve your experience with the World Eaters. If you want more from the Red Path, check out all of the links down below, subscribe to the channel and drop a comment saying what you want to see. If you aren't already in the Discord, you're missing out, so hop in and join the party. Any and all support is very welcome, but if you want to keep seeing more of this type of competitive content, supporting our Patreon is the best way to do it. Until the next one though folks, I've been Dara, you've been watching The Red Path, so stay healthy, stay safe, and kill, maim, burn.